Hey everyone, I am John Negroni, and this is John in Theory. And I kind of lied yesterday when I said that there would not be a Sunday show. There is a Sunday show. I ended up having more time today than I thought I would. We did our top films of 2020 for Cinemaholics. We took care of that this morning, and I just felt the urge to come back and do a pretty important video, a huge one for me actually, because it relates to one of my, one of the things that has really propelled me to the status that I have today, and that is a Pixar theory. If you don't know, the Pixar theory is something that I helped originate years and years ago, back in 2013. I wrote a blog post called The Pixar Theory that argues all the Pixar movies exist in the same universe. I've done some videos on the subject, including a video about the book that I did for the Pixar theory that is coming out soon, the new edition. And, I definitely, when I was planning this next week and just in general, like the kinds of videos that I want to do, I think it would be fun to do at least one Pixar theory sort of thing, like at least like one a week, if not one every 2 weeks. Obviously, don't want to force it. I only want to bring these things out if there's something that I feel like passionate about, that I want to talk about. And that's certainly the case for this particular episode of John in Theory, especially because it is part of a comment that was on my stream the other day from username NPH&g. So special thanks to that username. I do not know their gender, so I'll refer to them as they there. And this user left a few comments, very lengthy, like Pixar theory of their own, because they wanted to help understand how Soul and Coco could kind of coexist, right? And they had their own explanation for this. And it's actually very detailed. They wrote a lot about it, and I gave it a little bit of thought. And it's funny because it really coincides with my thinking and some of my like preliminary research and writing into how I think Soul ultimately is part of the Pixar theory. Now, I am well aware that the Super Carlin Brothers, which is a wonderful YouTube channel, good buddies of mine, they already put out their video of like how Soul fits into the Pixar theory. And I've mentioned on previous streams before that I do not plan to check out their video until I have already finished my chapter of Soul in the Pixar theory book. And the reason for this is very simple. I do not want to watch their video and then have any of their ideas creep their way into mine, because that wouldn't be fair to them. It would make my job very difficult, because then I wouldn't be able to think independently. The good thing is I've already sort of carved out the gist and a lot of the basics and points of how I think the movie ultimately shares with a lot of other Pixar films. And actually this stream is going to be a fine introduction to a lot of that content. So you're going to kind of get a sense of what I think very early on in my process. And because of that, that means that I might change my mind on a few of these things, since it is pretty early in my thinking. And I hope that it still really works, and I hope that you get something out of it. And I should restate, because I said what the Pixar theory is, but yeah, let me kind of take a step back here and kind of get to why this is a thing, and why I think like these movies sharing a universe kind of matters, at least for me. I know for me, first of all, it's a very fun exercise, and it is a testament to Pixar in general that they are able to have films that can share like a narrative. And for me, it's not just for the heck of it, really. It's really because I think these movies, when put together, actually have some really fun concepts that go well together. And it's kind of like a big puzzle to sort of fit the new movies into these things. And it's also a great introduction into film analysis. I've met a lot of people who have started their like film loving journeys with something like the Pixar theory, which allows them to think a little bit deeper about films in a fun sandbox. And then they move on to think even deeper about other films, including the Pixar ones, and realize and reveal things that they didn't even know they loved about these movies. And that is ultimately my goal. If the theory itself is something that doesn't help you love these movies anymore, by all means, bow out. It's not your thing, and that's totally all right. It's really for other people who, when they think about this stuff, it just makes it like feels like a satisfaction for being a fan of the films. And that's all the intention of this really is. So I see some people entering the chat here, and looks like people are rearing up to start diving into Soul and Coco, because I think a lot of us who are watching Soul, and a lot of us who kind of have the theory in the back of our heads like I do, we're wondering, especially with the trailers, okay, Soul has an idea of what the afterlife is, and it has something called the great beyond. It has something called the great before. And Coco is ostensibly one of the first Pixar movies to actually show what the afterlife kind of is in Pixar films, and that is the land of the dead in Coco. And there are obviously huge differences between these worlds. And at first glance, I could see a lot of people being like, well, I think that they kind of contradict each other a little bit, right? And how could you actually reconcile the land of the dead as we see in Coco with a totally different art style that we see in Soul? And the funny thing about that too is there is another Pixar movie that depicts what the afterlife looks like, and we'll get to that soon. And it actually has more to do with Soul than anything else. But hopefully, I'll be able to make a good case here. And I want to start by just kind of doing a rough overview of the comment that sparked this. And that came from, as I mentioned before, username NPH&g. And they had a theory that I kind of want to start with this and kind of go through it because they did want my take. I'm not going to be able to go through the whole thing, as it is very long. But the first thing they asked is, how did the world of the dead, Coco, and the world of souls come about? So they're thinking more of like how these things, came into existence. And they have a theory that has to do with like the good dinosaur, and they had an idea of maybe like the witch from Brave and time travel and stuff like that. And, it's not super relevant, I think, to what I want to talk about here. But I will say, like, my response to a lot of this is I think that there is a lot of fun imagination going on here. And I really appreciate the comment. There are some things in here that are really interesting, but they aren't. I don't think that they're totally fully fleshed out quite yet. I think that there needs to be a better connection here between like the movies, for example, like Inside Out and Good Dinosaur. There are some connections here that I didn't fully buy personally, but there is this obvious helpful narrative that they put forth about how the afterlife could be looked at as a dimension, right? And how Soul kind of introduces not introduces, but helps bring about this idea that when you die, it's not that you're going to a place and it's like a one-way thing. There actually are like dimensions and pathways between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which is something that jibes with Coco for sure. And they also mention the movie Brave, which I think is actually very relevant to these two films. So getting started here, I'm gonna bring up this image actually. This is Coco. This is the land of the dead, and as you can see, it is very colorful. It is very expressive. It is very indicative and representative, for good reason, of Mexican culture. So you might be thinking to yourself, how does that reconcile with Soul? Because Soul, as I'll bring up here, has a very different view of the afterlife. So this is an image of the stairway to heaven. That is Jerry and Terry, who are kind of doing the count, and they're seeing all the souls move into the great beyond. And yeah, this is a very, very stark contrast to what we see in Coco. So how do we resolve that? How does that make sense? Also showing here, this is what the great before looks like, which is a totally different plane. And that actually gets to how I think all of these different worlds do fit together. And that is because even these two, this one with the stairway to the great beyond, is completely different to this one, the great before. And it argues that there are multiple planes of existence, multiple dimensions, and they are dependent on their own factors of how souls can move in between them. Specifically, if you remember how Soul basically starts, we have Joe, and this is early on in the film. He tries to escape the stairway that would take him to the great beyond, and he kind of stumbles out of like through a force field and like falls through this like dimensional plane, and that's how he lands into the great before. And we of course know that the great before is full of souls that are mentors who have not actually moved on to the great beyond. And what's important about that is that there's not a hard and fast rule of like, oh, when you die, you go straight to the great beyond, which I think would create a huge contradiction to what we see in Coco. Because in Coco, when those characters die, we see them as skeletons in this other plane of existence. So why is that plane of existence that? And the one we have in Soul is very different, especially when we see in the souls here. You can't see like close up, but a lot of them are multicultural. So are there like Mexican people there? So how does that work? How could that possibly work? And I think what's nice about the way Soul lays this all out is that it makes it pretty clear that there are different factors and there are different rules for people who die, and they do different things. It's similar to what we see in this movie here, Brave. So if you recall in the movie Brave, there are these things called wisps, will o' the wisps. And in folklore, and as the movie kind of supplants itself, the wisps are supposed to be like ancestors. They're supposed to be dead beings, dead humans who are like guiding or maybe even mischievously guiding human beings. In fact, you could make the argument that they are sort of mentoring in a different way. And that is why I think it's fascinating. These wisps that exist long, long, long before a lot of the souls we see are amorphous blue pieces of energy, right? So yeah, one of the first things I was thinking of when I saw Soul was like, oh, that is a design that it just happens, coincidentally or not, to really mirror the art design of the souls that we see in Soul. And that leads me to believe that there is a good connection here. And specifically when we see Mor'du at the end of Brave, and spoilers for Brave, Mor'du at the end of Brave, when he dies, what happens? He becomes like a amorphous kind of blue thing that moves on and ostensibly goes to the great beyond. So that's kind of the setup here of like how the souls kind of exist in between the movies. But Coco, is Coco have the same afterlife as these souls? Like going back to this image, what is this world? What is this plane of existence? And why does it exist for Mexican culture, but it doesn't seem to exist for other cultures? And if you recall in the movie Coco, and I part of the reason I'm still working on this theory is because I have to rewatch Coco. So I'm going off of memory of a film I've only seen a handful of times. But that said, in Coco, if you recall, the rules of how you go to the land of the dead are very specific to Mexican culture. It all has to do with Day of the Dead. It has to do with photographs. It has to do with these rituals of like how you share the memories of the dead with your family so that you can still have visitation with them. You have to hang them over a certain wall and so on. So if you kind of see what I'm saying, the land of the dead seems to be a Mexican expression of an in-between like land of the dead that isn't quite the great beyond quite yet. And if you are a soul, for example, who is not ready to move on, and because there is still a memory of you that has been put up forth by the Day of the Dead, then that means you don't go to the great beyond yet. You're in the land of the dead for as long as your family remembers you. If you recall in Coco, I think it's like halfway through the film, there's a character we see who plays a song with Hector, and he disappears because he has finally been forgotten. So the idea there is that he would finally become the amorphous soul and he would go to the great beyond. And this actually resolves an issue, maybe not an issue, but kind of a contrivance I was a little nervous about with Soul. It's like, well, you know, Joe's not ready to die. He isn't at peace with this, but why are all these other people at peace with this? And I think the idea is that, for example, he's still middle-aged. He's still, like, a lot of people remember him. And he feels like an attachment to Earth that is very different from a lot of the other people who have moved on. And I think that's helped argued by like a lot of the souls in Coco who've been forgotten. They've been in this in-between for a long time, possibly. So there could be other land deads that are specific to other cultural afterlives. Think of like Norse mythology. You could fit all kinds of religions and stuff into that, anything you want. Greek mythology, what have you. And it's like almost like a purgatory or something that allows a soul that's not quite ready to move on, that still feels attached to Earth, to have a chance before they go to the great beyond. And to me, that would explain why so many of the souls are like, oh, you're moving to the great beyond. Isn't that great? Because to them, they're ready. It kind of reminds me of The Good Place, the NBC sitcom, which kind of explores this concept of like when you're ready to go through the door to like the great beyond, when you feel like, you know, you've experienced everything you feel like you need to experience and you're ready to just sort of move on. It's a hard concept to grasp, but yeah, I think that Coco kind of is getting to that, because if you look at this setting, this doesn't look like the end all for all living beings. You watch other Pixar movies, like, would you expect that these beings would go to the land of the dead? Not necessarily, because it very much seems that it's a Mexican culture thing, and it has its own rules, it has its own nomenclature and what have you. So part of the theory that username NH&g was also NPH&g was also bringing up was this idea of like human energy, kind of explaining like, why do we have things like the land of the dead? How are people able to go to these places and move in between dimensions? And so that's why I really, really want to bring this up. And it's this concept here, being in the zone. Another phrase for being in the zone is flow state. It's actually a thing of psychology where if you are, it's like a positive psychology thing. If you are in the right mental state, you can be like fully focused and fully energized, and you are like completely in the moment. And the movie Soul posits this thing as a good or a bad thing because it could create a lost soul in the sense of you're so focused on something you become lost. And what that reminded me of, without giving too much away of like big Pixar theory stuff, is the witch from Brave. So what I really like about this concept is that being in the zone, it almost makes it seem like it's possible for humans who are in a different mental state to focus their energy and have basically magical powers, being able to move through dimensions. So when I see Joe, for example, being able to harness this, using his passion for the piano and in his search for 22, he is able to do something that would seemingly be impossible, something he kind of learns from Moonwind, actually, in the movie Soul. And light spoilers for Soul, he is able to go from the earthly plane to the great before. And so this has my brain moving. This has me thinking like, oh, this is a power that we know could be in other Pixar movies, ones that I've argued, like the witch being able to use doors to go back in time. And the witch from Brave having magical powers in the first place could have a ton to do with her having this like flow state, this like in the zone thing. For her, what is her flow state? What is her in the zone thing? Apparently, it's carving wood, which, very funny stuff. I love the wood carver witch gag that we get from Brave. It's easily my favorite thing about that movie. So that said, what is it about the doors thing too? It actually connects to Coco as well, because in Coco, a bridge is what allows you to move between these planes. So there's obviously like a recurring theme of like these seemingly mundane things, like a door that would take you back in time or to another dimension, and a bridge that would basically do the same thing. So that's kind of the gist of like, my early thinking on how these movies connect. And to kind of sum up, it is the same sort of afterlife, but I think the afterlife in Pixar is very complicated, and there are multiple places you can go, depending on your culture, depending on your human experience, and if you're ready to move into the great beyond. But I do think at a certain point, every being in Coco, all the skeletons we see who are still celebrating life and still, in the land of the dead so they can go back and forth, they have not yet gone to the great beyond. One day they will. And it's possible that they might choose to do that, eventually, because in Coco, if you recall, we don't see everybody like in Miguel's like ancestry because it hasn't been a thing for that long, right? So if it was that surefire of a thing, you'd think that Miguel would have great grandparents and like his family would just be never ending. But it seems like at a certain point, these souls do decide, yes, it's time to move on. Enough people have forgotten them that they feel like it's time. And so that's a fascinating thing about the movie Soul. I did not expect this, but I think the movie Soul, if you put it with the Pixar theory, you could help explain some of the things in Coco that for me were a little, not confusing, but definitely had me thinking about other things besides how much I like the movie. So that is basically it. I'm going to check over some of my notes that I wrote down and see if there was anything I missed. Oh, this is a really good one. Okay, so Coco. I said before that the land of the dead kind of represents Mexican culture. And one of the things that made me realize that this shares commonality with Soul is that if you recall in the movie Soul, the Jerrys say something very specific about how they represent all of the energies in the universe coming together. But it's implied that everything that Joe is seeing is shaped by them so that he can comprehend it. So that's why when he's in the Great Before, there are all of these anachronistic things. When I say anachronistic, I mean he sees things like they have clipboards. They're quantum beings. Why would they have clipboards? Well, the idea is that he only comprehends what they think he needs to comprehend. That's the whole point. It's like he sees this like bureaucratic kind of like contemporary TED Talk sort of like culture, which for him is what he needs to see. And these beings are so powerful, they can create that. And so for me, if that's how he takes in this universe, it argues that like all the other beings and creatures who are there who speak different languages, they're seeing something very different. The Jerrys are like creating multiple realities for them and allowing them to sort of be like, for them to get the gist of what's going on so that it doesn't like frustrate them. It would explain, for example, why 22, who is mentored by all of these different souls like Abraham Lincoln and Mother Teresa and Gandhi, why they're able to have any sort of common language is because the Jerrys facilitate that. And so that to me means that the Jerrys are almost sort of facilitating the land of the dead to be something very specific to Mexican culture. It's a concept I'm still thinking through because I do not still fully understand the Jerrys and if they have anything to do with the humans themselves, because all of these beings and creatures of the universe are doing all of this for humans. Well, why? What is the point? And could there be a connection between the energies and the powers of the Jerrys and what we have with humans who, you know, if you know anything else about the theory, I argue that the humans in Pixar movies are very powerful and energized, and they can transmit personality onto a car or a toy or anything like that, right? So I'm still thinking through that. As I mentioned before, I'm still working on this segment of the book. In fact, that just this week I was really working on some fine details for The Good Dinosaur, which isn't super relevant to this aspect of the theory, the afterlife and energy stuff, but it is of course its own thing. And when I get to the soul chapter, I'm sure there's all kinds of extra stuff I'm going to think of. And, you know, I mentioned, there's tons of other people that are already writing their own how soul fits in the Pixar theory stuff. And I'm going to do my best to avoid all of that because honestly, I don't know what they're going to say about it. And I don't want anybody to accuse me of like plagiarism or anything like that if we arrive to like some of the similar ideas independently. And, you know, we want to avoid any accusations there. Last thing I'll say, I kind of mentioned the time travel thing. That's definitely still like perking in my brain of like how soul could help identify how all that stuff works. But if you have any anything else you want to add, anything that you would like me to respond to, definitely hit up in the comments like this username NPH&g did. So I'll do my best to prep and do a stream or something like for that if needed, if we can make it happen. But okay. That is it. Is there any holes in anything I said? Is there anything you maybe that I said that like sparked an idea that you had while you were listening that you think is really cool? Definitely let me know in the comments. I am going to shut down the live chat. I don't see any questions. I'll take a look, of course. So some people saying hello, lots of hellos. Hey everybody! I see some frequent live chat supporters. Thank you for checking out the videos so often. I really appreciate it. And like I see. Oh yeah. Callum is asking how everyone did. Callum, I appreciate, you come into the chat and you ask how people are doing. I appreciate that because that is the positivity I am here for. I hope everyone is doing well. And thank you, Sarah, for being excited for the book. I can't wait for it to be totally done. It's taking quite a while because I want it to be airtight and I want it to be as fun and useful as possible. Look like somebody has a video called Fixing the Pixar Theory. Look, we're all fixing the Pixar theory. If you look at the original Pixar theory, boy, oh boy, it is very rough. There is a lot of like original ideas I put in there that made no sense. But that's the fun of it, is like everybody gets to fix it. Everybody gets to add their own stuff to it. Everybody gets to have their own arguments and their own, like this user did. They wrote out a whole thing. It's really fun to read. You can find that comment in one of my recent videos. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's really cool. And they used a Google Translator because they were Brazilian. And I just super appreciate people going to that effort to get their ideas out there because it helps me come up with content for the streams. And I just fully appreciate people engaging with the theory as much as they do. It really is humbling. I know the people at Pixar, they love it. They love that you all are this passionate about their films. And because you turn your passion for the films into watching them and loving them on their own terms and having fun with them outside of the films. And that's always, as a content creator myself, when people have done that with things I've written, like novels and stuff like that, it's just, it's a really cool feeling. So, okay, that's it for me. Thank you as always for checking the stream out. I will be back tomorrow. Don't know what I'm talking about quite yet, but of course I will be checking the comments if anybody has